So, almost 8 years ago, I went through a really rough season. I saw a little fruit in my faith, and I felt no joy, and I would say I experienced a degree of depression with that. But as far as I knew, there were no big sin issues that I was ignoring. I wasn't dragging my feet about something I knew God wanted me to do. I hadn't withdrawn from participating or serving. I was doing the things I thought God wanted me to do. I just couldn't feel God's presence in any of it. He didn't feel close, and it all felt empty. I'm not sure how long it lasted. I wish I journaled at the time. I could give you details, but I'm thinking this built up over months. Sometime winter semester of 2017 into the early summer of that year. And before that, I'd sensed God's presence often. And if I noticed that I didn't sense His presence at any given time, I could do the things that are supposed to draw me close to God, and they worked. But in that season, it didn't work. I felt like there was something wrong with me, like I was somehow broken. I questioned my job doing campus ministry. But I kept reading my Bible, I kept praying, I kept participating with other Christians and doing my part. I kept singing the songs even though I didn't feel anything from them. I kept trying to spend time alone with God even though I didn't feel His presence. And then one day I heard a song on the Christian radio while I was driving, and it really struck me. So when I got home, I looked it up and downloaded it. It was a new release at the time from Hillsong United called Shadow Step. And honestly, the lyrics are a little bit mysterious, but some of the lines really resonated with me. The chorus is how the song starts, and here's what the chorus says. Light up the way of your heart. Move me like you do the mountains. Move me like you do the wind. And I'll chase your voice through the dark. Fix my eyes on the unexpected in the wonder of your shadow step. So take another step. As I listened to that, I just felt like it was about being in darkness and wanting to feel moved and rolling with unexpected things and taking another step of chasing God anyways. So I had a little prayer cave in our house at the time, very private space I made in a basement underneath the staircase. And it just hadn't been working lately, like all the other things in my spiritual life. But I printed off the lyrics and headed into my prayer cave and listened to that song over and over. And I sang it and I cried through it. And God used that song to finally rekindle a spark in me. And I began to feel His presence again. It was out of that dark season in 2017 that God began to build my vision for discipleship. And by midsummer, I was beginning to write the 1.0 version of our Beyond Me discipleship curriculum. Now, am I glad that I went through that dark season? That's really hard to say. I'm so glad for the outcome, but if I were able to reach the other side without going through that experience, I would totally skip it. But sadly, I don't think at the time I could have arrived at the same place without that experience. And I know some of you know exactly what I'm talking about with that dark, dry season. And some of you probably don't yet. I couldn't relate to that when I was your age. In fact, when Heather and I were first married and living in Mount Pleasant, I was in a small group at our church, and we went through a book on spiritual disciplines. And there was a whole section of one of the chapters that totally described this experience, but I completely missed it. It didn't sink in at all because I hadn't related to it yet. So if this doesn't resonate with you yet, just tuck it away so you'll be able to pull it back out when it does. We're in week 2 of a 7-week series called Growing Through Hard Things. Growing Through Hard Things. But like I was just saying, I had to go through this hard thing to be able to grow through it. I don't think I would have been able to reach that level of contentment and intimacy with God that I've experienced since then without going through that dark time. But it's an experience not limited to me. It has happened to you. It's not unique to the two of us. And we're not defective or broken for going through it. We're definitely not alone in multiple ways. And in fact, it's not an experience limited to this generation, yours or mine, or our American culture, or this century, or nearby centuries. In the late 1500s, there was a Spanish priest named St. John of the Cross, who wrote an 8-stanza untitled poem about a dark night. And the poem came to be known as the Dark Night of the Soul. And that phrase, dark night of the soul, does come to describe that experience that I just shared. When we seem to be doing the right things, but we just can't feel God's presence in it. And sometimes that follows on the heels of some special closeness with God, or some fruit that we see. And if the Shadow Step lyrics are a little mysterious, the Dark Night of the Soul poem is really mysterious, kind of obscure. Let me try to summarize what it says. It's looking at a couple of translations from Spanish to English. It starts with a longing for God, then a journey of pursuit and kind of secretive, then finding Him and having this wonderful, intimate closeness. And then suddenly it's cut off by God. And God's still there, but your sense of Him kind of goes numb at the end. It's just totally abrupt. Like, what is this? It doesn't talk about what happens next, which, in my opinion, is the most important part. But St. John of the Cross actually wrote a commentary about this poem later on. In it he said, "Oh then, spiritual soul, when you see your appetites darkened, your inclinations dry and constrained, your faculties incapacitated for any interior exercise, don't be afflicted. Think of this as a grace, since God is freeing you from yourself and taking from you your own activity." So how do we go from the horrible experience of the dark night of the soul to thinking it's a blessing from God? That's what we're going to figure out tonight. First, let's be clear about distinguishing this dark night from other situations. If I haven't committed to Jesus yet, maybe I've heard the gospel and haven't responded yet, or I'm still not sure quite what the gospel is, or if I'm actively harboring sin in my life, if I'm not pursuing God through spiritual disciplines or not engaging with other Christians, and then I say, God feels distant from me, well, yeah, that makes sense that God feels distant in those situations. The first part of James 4:8 is just really short. So James 4:8 says, "Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you." James described a simple cause and effect. God's waiting. He opened the door. He just wants us to step through it, and He'll be right there when we do. So if we're not trying to draw close to God, we probably won't. But the dark night of the soul is when we're trying to draw near, and we have experienced that closeness before, but the usual things aren't working. So let's look at another verse, Isaiah 50, verse 10. Isaiah 50, verse 10. I'm going to read it from the Holman Christian Standard, and the New American Standard says it pretty similarly. Isaiah 50:10. "Who among you fears the Lord, listening to the voice of His servant? Who among you walks in darkness and has no light? Let him trust in the name of Yahweh. Let him lean on his God." So if Isaiah's two questions at the beginning of that verse, if those questions are talking about the same person, that sounds like someone can fear God and be listening to His servant, who is Jesus, and still feel like they're in the dark. And if and when this happens, Isaiah's advice is to keep trusting and leaning on God in that situation. So when we experience that darkness, It usually feels like something's wrong with us. Maybe something's wrong with our church or our surroundings. We might feel like giving up our pursuit. But when it happens, there's nothing wrong with us. And God invites us to lean in and strip away the excess, to trust Him through it. Richard Foster described it in his book, Celebration of Discipline. That's actually the book that my church small group went through, Celebration of Discipline. He says, what does the dark night of the soul involve? We may have a sense of dryness, aloneness, even lostness. Any overdependence on the emotional life is stripped away. So our emotional health is super important. It can be related to our spiritual health. But if we're emotionally dependent on a person, we need their constant approval in every little thing for me to be okay, that's not healthy. Likewise, if I'm emotionally dependent on the things of God and church and the experiences themselves, that's not healthy either. The dark night of the soul is when God temporarily removes the emotional payoff from the things of God so that we can learn to rely on God Himself. This would have been a bullet point, I'll say it a couple times. The dark night of the soul is when God temporarily removes the emotional payoff from the things of God so we can learn to rely on God Himself. I'll say it one more time because it's long. The dark night of the soul is when God temporarily removes the emotional payoff from the things of God so we can learn to rely on God Himself. That's a hard thing to experience. Nobody wants that. But it's for our growth and our maturity. So open your Bible app to Mark chapter 9. And you have Bibles in the middle aisle if you want to borrow one. Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 8. Mark 9, 2 through 8. This could be an example of God doing this to some of Jesus' disciples. His three inner guys who are already the closest with Him. So Mark 9, 2 through 8 says, and after 6 days, Jesus took with Him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And He was transfigured before them, and His clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could reach them. There appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let's make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out from the cloud. This is my beloved Son, listen to Him. And suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. So when we talk about a mountaintop experience, that was like the ultimate one. Peter's there with his fishing buddies, James and John. They're hanging out with Jesus after an invigorating mountain hike. They're enjoying the view. And then suddenly Jesus starts glowing. And Moses and Elijah show up. So talk about an emotional payoff there on this little side excursion that those three had with Jesus. What does Peter say? Hey, Jesus, this is great. Let's build 3 shelters so we can just stay here. If we could, I think a lot of us would choose to just stay in our mountaintop experiences. A retreat, a mission trip, a vacation. But God stripped that experience away from them so they wouldn't rely on the experience. They needed to rely on Jesus Himself. Nobody would want to go through the dark night of the soul. Nobody would want that without understanding its purpose or what it could achieve in us. It's basically like looking forward to a major surgery. Nobody looks forward to that experience itself, but we can move toward it and toward that experience to embrace it because of the long-term benefit it can give. Seems like forever ago, but in 2019, I had open heart surgery to replace a leaky heart valve. And I would never want to go through that experience again. For the month after surgery, I had no energy. I laid on the couch with a blanket over me, shivering all through the month of August. If I bent over towards my feet, I felt like everything moved and my organs were going to come out my throat. I would never want that experience again. I would never want that for anybody else. But I'm thankful that it happened because of where I am now, what I'm able to do. Richard Foster, in that Celebration of Discipline book, writes, "The purpose of the darkness is not to punish us or afflict us. It is to set us free. It's a divine appointment, a privileged opportunity to draw close to the divine center." So when we come to that juncture, instead of trying to shake this dark emptiness ASAP, by getting busier or pouring on more distractions, just feeding ourselves with songs and podcasts and all these things, as strange as it sounds, the opposite might be exactly what we need. Look at the words of Psalm 131. Psalm 131, verses 1 through 3, it's the whole psalm. It's a song of ascents of David. "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore." So a weaned child is one who's finally content to not have his mother's milk, and he's moved on to solid foods. And that's a good description of someone who leans into the dark night of the soul and lets God finish the work of it. There's another quote from Richard Foster. "What should we do with such a time of inward darkness? Whether in the desert or at home, hold in your heart a deep inner listening silence, and there be still until the work of solitude is done." If that dark night of the soul is God's way of removing distractions that keep us from relying on God himself, then trusting him through times of stillness and solitude is a great path toward working through it, rather than trying to get out of it ourselves by adding more and more. So practicing solitude and stillness is a great path toward working through that dark night. Practicing solitude and stillness is a great path toward working through the dark night. So finding the right song isn't what brought me through my dark night. It was the times I spent alone with God, despite not feeling it. And that lasted for a season, and it was a hard thing. And then when God thought I was ready, he happened to use that song to show me he was revealing himself again. So a dark night might be longer or shorter for you. And God might use something different to restore the feelings when it's at the end. But seeking to trust and rely on God without the distractions is the path to get there. And that's what stillness and solitude are all about. It doesn't mean you move into a monastery and forget about church and serving and everything. It means you build into your quiet times some time focused on being alone with God and without external noise and internal chatter. Stillness isn't actively praying with words. It's trying to actively listen without interrupting with my own words. Say that again. Stillness time isn't actively praying with words. It's trying to actively listen without interrupting with my own words. If we brave the discomfort and awkwardness of solitude and stillness, the result can be deep refreshment and closeness with God on the soul level. So how do we pursue that stillness if we're unaccustomed to it? There's a whole chapter on it in our discipleship book, but let me give you an abbreviated version, some very simple, practical steps. Number one, find a place of solitude. So how do we pursue stillness? One, find a place of solitude. Personally, I would rather be outside for my stillness time if weather cooperates. The reading room on the fourth floor of the library is a pretty good spot. At my house, I currently use my office / sunroom off the back of our master bedroom instead of the dark cave downstairs. Number 2, give the time to God. So 1, find a place of solitude. 2, give the time to God. Say a short prayer of intention. Ask for God's peace, His closeness, encouragement to pull back the layers until it's only He who remains. Number 3, quiet your mind. Quiet your mind. Do your best to turn off the inner monologue, which is really challenging for me. Tune into a deep inner listening silence, as Richard Foster put it. It will take some time and practice for your inner voice to refrain from interrupting, like all the time. So just keep refocusing as needed. Number 4, rest in His refreshment. Rest in His refreshment. Give as long as it takes, or set a timer so you're not checking your watch during it. And finally, repeat as necessary. Repeat as necessary. I encourage you to try it out. It will most likely feel awkward, especially at first, but not as awkward as feeling dry and burned out and disconnected from God. So this practice of peeling back the layers and just focusing on God can help us grow through that season of dark nights. But it can also maybe help prevent them. If God sends us the dark night of the soul because we're relying on all the peripherals instead of on Him, then establishing a habit of stillness can help us become content in Him alone, hopefully without the painful step. So, when you're doing what normally works, and you too feel connected to God, but then it's not working anymore, and you're starting to slip into that dark night of the soul, don't panic. Don't give up. Don't add a bunch more distractions. Don't assume there's something wrong. Instead, lean into it and trust God to ensure your faith and commitment in your reliance on Him. Let me pray. God, I thank you for tonight. God, I thank you that you want us to trust you and not just the things of you. That those are meant to be a blessing, but sometimes we can get caught up in them. And God, I pray that we would choose to tune into you before you need to strip it away from us. And if any of us are in that right now, God, I pray that you would end that season soon and just help us to be able to rely on you and tune into you and trust you alone, regardless of whether there's the perks. And pray that you would restore the joy to it, God, and the feeling of it. God, we thank you for tonight. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So,